Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats. We are about to start this program. Please, may I have your attention, please? Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this special evening, which is organized by the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. And it is my great privilege to introduce Kerry Kennedy, who is an inspiration, a lawyer devoted to the rule of law, an author of 3 books, of which one is a New York Times bestseller, mother of 3 daughters. She is an advocate and an activist. She is the leader of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, which partners with the bravest people on earth, as you're going to hear soon, to create lasting change. Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights supports defenders in the field with advocacy, litigation, and training, and brings human rights to students in the classroom with its innovative Speak Truth to Power, which you will see, a special curriculum, and engages the financial community about sustainable investing and intersection between business and human rights. In her devotion and her hard work, you can see that the torch that her father and uncle raised so high, the torch that in the 1960s inspired a generation of youth like myself, has now passed on to a new generation. Last year was 50 years since Robert F. Kennedy was slain by an assassin's bullet. Now his daughter Kerry has produced a new book about his legacy, Ripples of Hope. And she says her father taught her that peace is not something just to pray for. And she says that she took all that to heart and reflects. My father suffered the unspeakable tragedy of losing a brother to gun violence. He was a victim of gun violence himself, and these moments leave us speechless. But together we have a voice that can call for an end to Islamophobia and white supremacy, of which we were reminded this morning of the horrible activities in New Zealand. So she says, together we have a voice, and now is a time to act. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Kerry Kennedy.
Thank you, Ismail, and thank you all for coming this evening and being ready to listen again, because I think you've been listening all day long. I'm Kerry Kennedy, as you heard, the president of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. And I just thought I'd start by telling you a short story about my father. Would that be okay? So there's lots that's been written about him in history books, but this is a very personal story. So when I was growing up, I had 10 brothers and sisters, and I was the 7th of 11. So as you can imagine, there were lots of battles in my household. But I remember one in particular. I was with my brother Michael, and I was maybe 6 or 7 years old. And we were playing in our magnolia tree. We were playing World War II. He was older and better aimed, so he got to be the Americans. And I was younger, so I had to be the doomed Germans. And he was in the top of the tree, and he was throwing magnolia pods down at me. Now, magnolia pods look exactly like grenades, but they feel like rocks when they hit your head. So he hit me a few too many times, and I scrambled out of the tree, and I ran up to my father's study. And I had these tears streaming down my face, and my white bow askew. And I jumped into my father's arms, and he said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "My brother was throwing magnolia pods at my head." And he said, "You go get Michael and bring him here." And I thought, justice will be done. The Attorney General of the United States of America wants to see you now. And so up came my brother. And my dad said, now, Michael, you be quiet, and Kerry, tell me everything that happened. And I told him the whole saga. And then he said to me, now, Kerry, you be quiet, and Michael, you tell me what happened. And that was hard, and it was irritating. And I can't remember all the details, but I know this, that in the end, I realized that I wasn't all right, and my brother wasn't all wrong. And then he made us kiss and make up and go to our rooms and read for an hour. And I think that the lessons my father had for us as children were the lessons he had for our country and for our world. That number one, we have to stop seeing our adversaries as our enemies and start thinking about them as our brothers and sisters, because peace is something not just to be prayed for, as Ismail said, but something that we all have a responsibility for. And number two, that we all must have a system of justice that people believe in and that people think is fair. And third, that there's no substitute for education. You must read, you must learn. That's why 20 years after that Magnolia story, I found myself in pursuit of courage. And I spent 2.5 years traveling around the world interviewing the bravest people on earth, people who had faced imprisonment and torture and death for basic rights which most of us are lucky enough to take for granted. They were people like Elie Wiesel, who survived the Holocaust as a child. And he said, my dream for the future is that your children will never have my past. And they were people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa, the great anti-apartheid leader. And he said, we don't have a God who says, ah, gotcha. We have a God who lifts us up and dusts us off and tells us to try it again. And to me, those are really the bookends of human rights. On the one hand, having on the one hand, stopping the atrocities, and on the other hand, having the faith in the capacity of the human spirit to triumph even under the worst of circumstances. Now, those interviews I put together in this book, Speak Truth to Power, and then that book was written into a play. And you're going to see a short excerpt of that play tonight. It was written by a great Broadway playwright called Elie Wiesel. But I think when you listen to the stories that you're going to hear tonight, it's important to think about these people, about these human rights defenders. And I think their stories are more important now than ever before, because we are living in a world of upheaval. And they teach the next generation that you don't have to wait for government to take action. You don't have to wait for your priest or your religious order to take action. You don't have to wait for your parents to tell you what to do. All of us are citizens. All of us have the capacity to create change. All of us can seek to create communities and countries and a globe that's based on peace and justice and compassion towards those who suffer. And that, in the end, is the lesson of Speak Truth to Power. We have written these into lesson plans. They've been taught to millions of students around the world, and today they're available to 30 million students. And if anybody here wants to bring them to your countries or to your schools, let me know, because we're ready to go to them. Margaret Mead said, Never doubt the capacity of a small group of determined people to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. When I started working in human rights in 1981, all of Latin America was under right-wing military dictatorships. Today, there's not one left standing. And all of Eastern Europe was under communism. And today, there's not a communist government left standing. South Africa was under apartheid. Today, South Africa has had a series of freely elected governments elected by a majority of their people. And women's rights was not on the international agenda. Today, CEDAW, the Women's Rights Convention, has been signed by 183 countries. All those changes happen not because governments wanted them to. Governments tried to stop them. And not because big armies wanted them to. Militaries tried to stop them. And not because enormous multinational corporations wanted them to. Multinational corporations tried to stop them. But because small groups of determined people, people like the people in this room, gathered together and harnessed the dream of freedom and made it come true. That is the lesson of history, that is the lesson of today, and that is the joy and hope for tomorrow. Please welcome the cast of Speak Truth to Power.
My name is Judge Iris Yasmin Barrios. In the early 80s, Guatemala was ruled by General Rios Montt, who targeted the Mayan Aixil people. Under his brutal regime, the army burned more than 400 indigenous communities to the ground. Thousands of women and girls massacred tens of thousands of Indians and conscripted thousands more into community patrols, forcing them to kill their own people. No nation had ever brought genocide charges against its own head of state until Guatemala. I presided over the trial of General Rios Montt, and in May 2013, I sentenced him to 80 years in prison. Shortly after my ruling, allies of the old regime struck back against me and my colleagues. The Constitutional Court invalidated the sentence, and Guatemala's Bar Association suspended me for practicing law for a year. But I'm standing my ground. People ask how I continue. I'm a lawyer. I believe in justice, so it's easy. Speak truth to power.
My name is Muhammad Yunus. I started the Grameen program to provide access to credit for the poor. The professionals say development involves multi-million-dollar loans for enormous infrastructure projects. But I work with real people in the real world. The night before a woman is going to get her $35 from the bank, she will be tossing and turning to decide whether she is really going to be able to repay the loan. And then she holds the money, and she will tremble, and tears will roll down her cheeks, and she won't believe we would trust her with such a large amount of money, $35. And she struggles to pay that first installment and the second installment, and she goes on for 50 weeks in sequence, and every time she is braver. And when she finished her last one, she wants to celebrate. It's not just a monetary transaction that has been completed. She felt she was nobody, and she really did not exist. Now she can almost stand up and challenge the whole world, shouting, "I can do it. I can make it on my own." Speak truth to power.
My name is Fauzia Kasinja. I'm from Togo. I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't marry that man. I was 17 and he was 45 and already had 3 wives. But my aunt said, I know you don't love him now, but once you get kakia, you will learn to love him. Tomorrow will be the day of kakia. But with the help of my sister, I escaped from Togo. I managed to make my way to the United States with a false passport. I told my immigration officer at New York airport that I wanted asylum, and I told him everything. Well, not everything, because it is so embarrassing. I didn't mention kakia to her because I know she probably wouldn't understand. Whether I got asylum or not was up to the judge. She said, so you will go to the prison. They put me in chains. In the detention center in New Jersey, I met Cecilia Jeffrey, another prisoner. She treated me like a daughter. When I'd go to bed, she would come and took me in. I was so sick and they gave me no medicine. And I thought, if I'm going to die, why don't I go back? And Cecilia said, are you crazy, Fauzila? Do you know what are you going back for? Do you know? The next day, Cecilia was in the shower and asked me to come, and she was standing in there, and she opened her legs apart and said, look, is this what you want to go back to? I didn't know what I was seeing. Do you know what is this? I didn't know. I didn't look palm of my hand. And the only thing you could see was a scar, like the stitch, and just a little hole. That's it. No lips, nothing. Kakia. I said, you live with this? And she said, yes, all my life. I cry all the time when I see it. I cry inside. I feel weak. I feel defeated all the time. And I looked at her and saw the strongest woman on earth outside. You can't really tell that she is suffering. She is the most loving person I ever met. She made me stay. She made me stay and win my case. Speak truth to power.
My name is Jamie Nabozny. When I was in 7th grade, kids were calling me fag and queer. I told the guidance counselor who directed me to the principal of the school. And the principal said, I will take care of it. But nothing changed. One day I was in a bathroom with my brother, and some kids actually ended up pushing us into the stalls and punching us. And I thought, okay, now that it's turned violent, the principal has to do something. But she said to me, Jamie, if you are going to be so openly gay, these kids, kinds of things are going to happen to you. I attempted to kill myself. Partially through my 8th grade year, I was in a science class, and 2 boys started grabbing me and pushed me to the ground and pretended like they were raping me in front of the entire class. I ran to the principal's office, expecting surely she's going to do something now. It's a sexual thing. And she just looked at me and shook her head and said, Jamie, if you don't have an appointment, then don't have anything. and I don't have anything to say to you. In high school, they beat me so badly, and I had to be taken to the hospital. I had to have emergency abdominal surgery for internal bruising and bleeding. I knew I wasn't ever going to be safe at school. Then I met this crazy lesbian lawyer, and we won. And school administrators now have a personal responsibility to protect students from harassment, and if they do not, they can be individually sued, like a doctor for malpractice. I have always said, I don't care why people do the right thing, they just need to do right thing. Speak truth to power.
My name is Jessica Lennihan. I'm from Castle Rock, Colorado. 12 years ago, my estranged husband kidnapped our daughters, Rebecca, Catherine, and Leslie, from our front yard. Panicked, I repeatedly called the Castle Rock police for help. It quickly became clear that the restraining order against my husband was worthless. The police told me that I shouldn't worry and that I should give it a few hours. Meanwhile, the police did respond to a fire lane violation, looked for a lost dog, and took a long dinner break. Over the next 10 hours, the police refused to try to find my daughters. Hours later, my husband drove up to the police station and opened fire. He was killed in the shootout, and the bodies of my girls were found in the back of his truck. I sued the town of Castle Rock for failing to enforce the restraining order and took my case to the US Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court ruled my constitutional rights had not been violated by the failure to enforce the restraining order. I felt utterly abandoned, but I wasn't done fighting. Along with attorneys from Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights and the ACLU, I filed a petition before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, arguing that the failure of the police and the courts to provide justice constituted a violation of international human rights law. On August 17, 2014, the Commission issued a landmark decision that found the US had violated my human rights and those of my 3 children. Despite everything I've lost, I still have hope that our government will use this ruling as an opportunity to make things right, to provide the protection and accountability that will prevent a tragedy like the one I suffered from occurring again. Speak truth to power.
My name is Malala Yousafzai. In January 2009, when I was in the 7th grade, I started blogging for the BBC about a Taliban edict in Pakistan's Swat Valley that banned girls like me from going to school. I wanted to scream, shout, and tell the whole world what we were going through, but it was not possible. The Taliban would have killed me, my father, my whole family. So I chose to write with a different name, and it worked. My valley has been freed. Still, I paid a price. On the 9th of October 2012, the Taliban shot me on the left side of my forehead as I rode the bus home from school. They shot my friends too. They thought that the bullets would silence us, but they failed. Suddenly, the few of us calling for justice in Pakistan were joined by thousands of voices around the world. The terrorists thought that they would change our aims and crush our ambitions. But nothing changed in my life except this. Weakness, fear, and hopelessness died. My courage is as strong as ever. I am the same Malala. My ambitions are the same. My hopes are the same. My dreams are the same. Speak truth to power.
If we don't do this, who will? My name is Digno Ochoa. I am a nun and a lawyer. My father was a union leader in Veracruz, Mexico. In the sugar factory where he worked, he was involved in the struggles for running water, roads, and securing land certificates. Then he was disappeared and tortured. The charges against him, fabricated. And then I myself was disappeared and held incommunicado for 8 days by the police. Now I felt in the flesh what my father had felt, what other people had suffered. I've always felt anger at the suffering of others. If an act of injustice doesn't provoke anger in me, it could be seen as indifference, passivity. One time, we filed a habeas corpus decree on behalf of a man who had been disappeared for 20 days. The authorities denied having him in custody and then denied us access to the state hospital where he was being held. During a change in shifts, I slipped in. I got to the door of his room and took a deep breath, opened the door very violently, and yelled at the federal judicial police inside. I told them they had to leave immediately because I was this person's lawyer, and I needed to speak to him. They didn't know how to react, so they left. I had 2 minutes, but it was enough to get him to sign a piece of paper proving he was in the hospital. Then the police came back, fierce. They didn't expect me to assume the attack position. Hey! The only position in karate I know, from the movies, I suppose. Of course, I don't really know karate, but they thought I was going to attack. Trembling inside, I said that if they laid a hand on me, they'd see what would happen. And they drew back, saying, "You're threatening us." And I said, "Take it any way you want. Speak truth to power."
My name is Kailash Satyarthi. When I was a little boy, there was a man and his son who ran a shoe shine stand outside of my school. I couldn't understand why the boy, who was about my age, wasn't in the school like me. One day, when I was 6 years old, there was a very heavy rain. When I was coming back to school from lunch, I saw the man beating his son, who was crying for help. I rushed to them and asked the father, "What is wrong with you? Why you are beating your son?" He gestured to the soldier shoes on the ground and said, Don't you see that all these shoes are destroyed? I presumed that there would be rain, so I gave my son the plastic sheet to cover all customers' shoes, but instead he covered himself. The shoes are ruined. Who will bear the cost? I was angry and I started crying. I said, don't you think that his head and his body are much more precious than these shoes? The father had no answer. Suddenly, he grabbed his son and started weeping. At the moment, I realized that if you speak with a conviction and tell the truth, things can change. That was the beginning. Today, we work in thousands of villages in India and over 140 countries around the world. Child labor is not an isolated problem. Globalized markets, transnational corporations, consumer demand for cheap goods, all these cumulatively create and perpetuate child labor globally. We have emancipated over 80,000 children from slavery, but we can't do it all. That is why it is critical that we build a worldwide movement. We must globalize compassion, speak truth to power.